Hello and welcome to the final review of Request Month 2018. This is Strife, also known as Strife Quest for the Sigil, for originally DOS, but it was later re-released as Strife Veteran Edition for PC, Mac, and Linux. What you're seeing here is Veteran Edition. This is a first-person shooter developed by Rogue Entertainment and originally published by Velocity Inc. back in 1996 for DOS, and it was later resurrected by Night Dive Studios, who developed the Veteran Edition. It's basically a source port of the game, and it was released in 2014 for PC, Mac, and Linux. It also comes with a few convenience enhancements as well as support for modern resolutions and things like that, so it is nice to have that, but I'm really more concerned about the game itself. On its launch, it was generally fairly well received, although it did get overlooked quite a bit because it came out in an era where Duke Nukem 3D and Quake were the big dogs on the market, and, well, let's face it, if you got Quake on the market at the same time as something running in the Doom engine, it's not hard to see why people would overlook something like this. Which is actually a shame, because Strife was well ahead of its time with things like a mostly voiced cast, as well as not needing to just run around and blow the living crap out of everything in your path, as well as a branching story depending on your choices, and even some more RPG-like features, the likes of which were toyed a bit with in the original System Shock, but you wouldn't really see come into their full fruition until System Shock 2 and the original Deus Ex. Now, of course, it being a very early attempt at that sort of thing, we would look back on it as being a bit of a primitive RPG FPS hybrid, but it is still there nonetheless. So, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out how one of the earliest attempts at an RPG first-person shooter actually turned out. Well, as far as presentation is concerned, like I said before, this does run on the Doom engine, which means that by '96 this was looking fairly dated. I mean, that was the same year we got Duke 3D and Quake, both of which looked far superior than this in terms of technical achievement. But that's not to say that Strife is a slouch or anything. They did the best they could with what they had to work with, and what you have here is some fairly impressive graphics, at least for the Doom engine. Everything's bright and colorful and has this kind of cartoony art style going on, and the aesthetic of the universe is techno-fantasy, so it actually looks relatively unique in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, the animations are rather low in frame count, and they're not particularly smooth or fluid, but they do work rather well for what you would expect from a Doom engine game. And ultimately, despite it looking rather dated even for its time, it ends up holding up surprisingly well, just because they've done such a good job with the aesthetics and making sure that everything is about as detailed as you can actually manage with the Doom engine, so they actually deserve kudos for that. Then, of course, you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit more interesting. On the one hand, you have sound effects, which do their job, but are nothing particularly special. I mean, none of the gunner explosion sounds are really all that beefy. And as a result, you don't really feel like any of your weapons have all that much impact behind them, even though they clearly do when you actually see the effects on screen. The music is alright, but nothing really to write home about. I mean, a lot of it is more fast-paced MIDI tracks that make sense for a Doom engine game, but outside of the confines of the game, you're not really going to remember any individual track. But then there's the one aspect of the sound design that is actually rather surprising for that era, which is the amount of voice acting in it. All of the main characters that you'll interact with are fully voiced, which means that when you go up to them, not only when you talk to them will you see the big sprawl of text as well as see their portrait, but you'll actually hear someone's voicing all of those lines. Now, of course, these days we look at basically anything that's not fully voiced as being a bit outdated, but back in that day, that was pretty much unheard of. And even though nearly all of it is just really cheesy and amateurish, there are a few lines here and there that are voiced rather well, and Blackbird is consistently pretty well voiced. But here's the thing, even if the lines aren't necessarily well voiced, they're cheesy enough that it actually lends the game quite a lot of charm. And thus when you bring all the presentation together, even though the visuals are dated and only some of the characters are voice acted, it just has a lot of charm behind it, and that voice acting does mean that Strife was ahead of its time. But as well as the presentation holds up, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as an unnamed mercenary who ends up working together with a group called the Front in order to take down an organization known as the Order. You see, the backstory is that a comet landed that brought with it this horrific virus that causes all kinds of horrible mutations, and a particular group kind of started going nuts and eventually became what is known as the Order, which now rules the world with an iron fist, both literally and figuratively, because they are full of completely cyber-enhanced soldiers, because that's pretty much the only way they can survive the virus. It's also the only way that they can continue adding more members to their ranks, so they have this army of cyberized soldiers as well as mechanized troops. And the front is, of course, the resistance organization that is trying to take down the Order and restore freedom to all of the people. As you go on your mission to take down the Order, you eventually find out more about what's going on with their plans and this thing called the Sigil, which is an artifact that was split apart into multiple pieces, and when all the pieces are put together, you basically will rule the entire planet. So it quickly becomes a storyline of trying to prevent the Order from getting all those pieces together and collect them all yourself so that the front can take them down quickly and restore freedom. Except things get a bit more complicated than that, and the plot introduces a couple of twists later on that, depending on what you decide to choose as a result of these twists, will actually affect the outcome of the story. It's one of the most prominent early examples of a branching story in a first-person shooter that I'm aware of, and it ends up being something that was well ahead of its time because, like I said before, we wouldn't see that sort of thing arise again until the likes of, say, Deus Ex. And for what it's worth, while the plot isn't particularly impressive, it is decent enough to keep your interest throughout, and they do a pretty good job with the implementation of the choice and consequences. The thing is that even though it does include these choices, and you do have some degree of agency with regards to how the story turns out, it's definitely not a role-playing game. It only has role-playing game elements, and it is definitely a first-person shooter before it is anything else. The vast majority of the game is spent running around blasting the living crap out of pretty much anything that gets in your way, although this isn't necessarily the only option you have. This is one of the earliest first-person shooters I'm aware of to introduce something akin to a stealth system, where you can actually go up to enemies and use your punch dagger in order to take them down quietly, or to use the crossbow in order to take them down quietly, as opposed to having to run in guns blazing. It's an extremely basic stealth system, and it barely even functions, but it is in the game, and it's actually interesting that they decided to implement something like that. Because let's face it, you think Doom Engine, and the very first thing you think of is running and gunning at about 90 miles an hour, and that's definitely where the game is at its best, let's face it. Because you do get a pretty good variety of weapons to choose from. I mean, you got your basic assault rifle, you've got a crossbow that can switch between electric bolts and poison bolts, the poison bolts taking down acolytes in a single shot. You have a couple of explosive weapons like a rocket launcher and a grenade launcher, as well as a flamethrower eventually, and of course you eventually get access to the Sigil itself, which is a magic weapon that does an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage, but it uses your health as ammunition. As you collect more parts for the Sigil, it actually gets more powerful as well, so that's something to keep in mind. There's also a good variety of enemies. You have your basic acolytes which run around and shoot at you, but you also have these spider drones that will climb around the ceilings and come after you and do melee attacks, and there's even numerous mechanized enemies that will come after you and have various powerful weaponry that you have to avoid, whether that be rocket launchers or particularly irritating hit scan enemies that will just do a ton of damage to you, and thus you have to prioritize them before you can go after anything else. And that brings up something that is important to mention. The enemy variety is good and the weapon variety is good, but this game still ends up being rather difficult because the amount of damage you take is pretty ridiculous, and the amount of healing that you can do is actually rather low. There are 3 healing items at your disposal: med patches, which restore a very small amount of health, medical kits, which restore about 25 hit points, and then surgery kits that restore your health to full. You can collect these either by running around the various levels and just finding them, or you can also go to various stores that are scattered around the game world, and you can actually purchase them with gold that you will either find in the world or earn from missions. This brings up something that is important to mention, because in addition to going around and doing the main story and doing all that stuff, you can actually run around and just talk to pretty much everybody you run across, and some of them will have a bit of side things that you can do, or they'll give you a bit of a tip on what you should do next, or more likely than not, they'll just tell you to go away. Point is that it's not your typical first-person shooter of the 90s in that you don't need to run around and mow down everything in your path. In fact, a lot of cases, it won't necessarily be a good idea to do that. Sometimes stealth is the better option, and eventually you actually get access to an officer's uniform that will allow you to wander around the vast majority of that particular area, the military base, without actually triggering any alarms or actually attacking people. Most of the guards are not immediately hostile to you, although all of the mechanized troops are, so that's something you need to keep in mind. And of course, if an alarm's been triggered, or if you're in specific areas, then everything is going to be hostile no matter what, so you you might want to leverage your stealth when you can. Because I don't know about most players, but I was actually having a hard time keeping up with ammunition throughout the vast majority of the game because enemies can take quite a bit of damage before going down, and of course certain enemies are not particularly susceptible to certain weapons. So for example, you might be able to take down an acolyte with a single poison bolt, but if you try to do that on, say, a mech, it's not really going to do much. Generally speaking, you are given enough ammunition to do what you need to do, but this is definitely a game where you don't want to be just running around wasting as much ammunition as possible. You want to pick your shots when you can. And you will actually notice that there are certain weapons trainers that will give you bonuses to your accuracy, which is something you don't really think about in an early 90s FPS. The assault rifle in particular tends to have quite a lot of spread to it, so if you fire it in more controlled bursts, it actually ends up being more effective. This is of course offset as you go through the game and you get those bonuses to accuracy, but at the same time, it's not really something you're going to be expecting right out of the gate. You may also not necessarily expect to be able to upgrade your health as you go through the game, but you will be able to come across these stamina upgrades that will add an additional 10 points of health whenever you get them. It's a pretty nice progression of power. You start off relatively weak, and then as you continue through the game, not only do you get access to more weaponry and such, but both your health and accuracy improve, and you become a much more efficient order fighting machine. But here's the thing, you gotta keep in mind this was running on the Doom engine and it is a mid-90s first-person shooter, which means that all of these systems are fairly primitive. There's not really any real variety of equipment. I mean, you have armor, which basically consists of, is it leather or is it metal? If it's metal, then you get 200 points of it. If it's leather, you get 100 points of it. That's it. The health and accuracy upgrades are really the only major upgrades you're going to be encountering as a character throughout the game, so it's not like you're going to be seeing a lot of RPG-like stats. And on top of that, it's not like this is a real open world or anything like that, so you don't have a wide variety of side quests. You have the main missions and basically one or two side activities as you play through the game. And of course, like I mentioned before, the actual outcomes of the story are really more of a binary choice than anything else, and there's not really all that much role-playing involved there. So what you end up with in general is a rather solid 90s first-person shooter with some interesting elements that definitely put it ahead of its time, although they are definitely primitive enough that they don't really make it a proper first-person shooter and role-playing game hybrid. It's more like they just took a few elements that they liked from role-playing games and tossed them into the game as a bit of a spice. But here's the thing, even though everything I've already mentioned is generally pretty solid, the game's not without its problems. The first and most noticeable issue is that some of the levels are very confusing to navigate. This is simply because with certain environments there's not really a whole lot of markers that you can use as just orientation. So in most other first-person shooters that are well designed, you're going to have certain markers scattered throughout the level that will allow you to instantly orientate yourself and go, okay, I am here, I need to go over this way next. And Strife doesn't really have all that much of that. It has enough to get the job done in most of the levels, but some levels here and there, like for example the sewer level, are just kind of obnoxious with it. Next problem is that the healing items are really not all that effective. Like I said before, the med patches barely heal you at all. It's basically 10 points of health per, and then the medical kits are only 25 hit points per, and even though the Veteran Edition at least uses them automatically, more likely than not, you're just going to run out of them very quickly because you do take an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage at times. The damage you do take tends to be fairly inconsistent as well. Sometimes you will take absolutely huge amounts of damage, and sometimes that same enemy will barely even scratch you. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And of course, the healing items don't work the same way in this that they do in other first-person shooters. They actually are inventory items that when you pick them up, they don't instantly heal you. They sit in your inventory until you want to select them and use them, or if they're used automatically, of course. And of course, like I mentioned before, the stealth system is so poorly implemented that you may as well not even bother with it half the time, because you're probably going to trigger an alarm anyway. There's only a few applications where it is actually useful, and if you're using the punch dagger, then that thing's practically useless. The enemy's probably going to get a shot off anyway, which instantly alerts everyone in the area. So stealth doesn't really become viable until you actually get access to those poison bolts that I mentioned before. And even then, it's only viable if pretty much everything you're encountering is acolytes. If you're running into mechanized troops, then they spot you and are instantly hostile to you anyway, so it ends up not really mattering all that much. But at the end of the day, Strife is definitely a bit of a gem of its era, because even though it was definitely overlooked in its time, and its graphics are certainly dated and everything, it tried things that were very different for first-person shooters at the time. Even though it didn't always succeed, it still ended up being a very solid first-person shooter that is well worth playing if you're into that genre, at least in that style of gameplay. Because if you don't already like those classic Doom-style first-person shooters, then you're probably not gonna like Strife either. But if that's your thing, then I'd say go ahead and give Strife a shot. I will have a link in the video description box to where you can pick up the Veteran Edition if you are interested. Thanks for watching.